I remember the morning my sons came to take my home as clearly as I remember the day they were born, and that is what made it hurt in a way I cannot fully explain. Because both moments carried the same weight of change, yet one was filled with hope, and the other with something I could not name at first. The house was quiet that day, the kind of quiet that settles deep into your bones, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I had woken up early, as I always did, swept the courtyard, watered the plants, and made myself a cup of tea, not knowing that I was walking through my home as its owner for the last time. Every corner of that house held a piece of my life, from the faded curtains I had stitched myself to the small cracks in the wall that marked the years we had lived through together, and I moved through it all with the comfort of someone who believed it would always be hers. When the gate opened around noon, I felt a small shift inside me, a quiet unease that I tried to ignore, because a mother does not expect harm when her own children arrive at her door. My elder son walked in first, his steps firm and his face set in a way I had not seen before, followed by the younger one who lingered behind, his eyes avoiding mine as if he already knew something I didn't. They didn't greet me the way they used to. There was no warmth in their voices, no softness in their expressions, and that absence spoke louder than anything they eventually said. I offered them tea out of habit, out of love, out of everything I had always been, but they refused without hesitation, and that simple refusal felt like the first crack in something much larger. We sat in the living room, the same room where they had once played as children, where I had stayed awake through long nights nursing their fevers and worrying about their futures. And now they sat across from me like men discussing a matter of business. My elder son cleared his throat and said they needed to talk, and something about the way he said it made me realize that whatever was coming had already been decided long before I was included. He spoke calmly, carefully, explaining that the house was too big for me now, too much responsibility, too difficult to maintain, as if the home I had managed for decades had suddenly become beyond me overnight. I tried to smile, to brush it off, to hold on to the normalcy of the moment, but his words continued, each one more distant than the last, until I understood that this was not concern, this was preparation. He said the area had become valuable, that the land was worth a lot now, that it didn't make sense to keep it the way it was, and I noticed how he kept saying land instead of home, as if removing emotion would make the decision easier to accept. I looked at my younger son then, hoping he would say something, anything that sounded like the boy I had raised, but he only stood there quietly, his silence pressing against me like a weight I couldn't lift. When I asked them what they meant, the answer came too quickly, too smoothly, as if rehearsed. They wanted to sell the property. Just like that, years of memories reduced to a transaction, to a number, to something that could be calculated and divided. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept my voice steady as I asked the only question that mattered to me in that moment. Where was I supposed to go? My elder son didn't hesitate. He told me they had already arranged a place for me, a smaller portion in the city closer to them, easier for me to manage. And the way he said it made it clear that this was not a suggestion. It was a decision. Arranged. That was the word he used, not discussed, not offered, but arranged, as if my life could be packed up and moved without my consent. I repeated the word in my mind, trying to understand when I had lost the right to decide for myself, when I had become someone whose future could be planned by others without even being asked. The room felt different then, smaller somehow, as if the walls that once protected me were now closing in. And I realized that I was sitting in a place that no longer belonged to me in the way I had always believed it did. I asked them when they had decided all of this, and instead of answering, my elder son spoke about practicality, about timing, about opportunity, avoiding the truth that would have hurt more than anything else. That they had made this choice without me. My younger son finally spoke, telling me not to make things difficult, and I almost laughed at that, because I was not the one who had turned a home into a problem. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because something inside me was beginning to shift, something quiet but firm, something that refused to break even as everything around me seemed to change. I asked again if everything had already been decided, and this time my elder son didn't pretend otherwise. He simply said they needed my signature. That was when everything became clear. They were not there to talk. They were there to complete something, to finalize something that had already been put into motion. I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had worked endlessly to build this life, that had sacrificed comfort and rest to ensure they had everything they needed. And now those hands were being asked to sign it all away. I felt a deep ache rise within me, not just from what they were doing, but from how easily they were doing it, how naturally they had stepped into a world where I was no longer central. I told them they should have asked me, and my eldest son replied that they were thinking about my future. But I knew better. I knew that this was about their future, their plans, their convenience. The truth settled inside me then, heavy but undeniable. I was no longer their priority. I was an obstacle. When I asked who the buyer was, he told me it was a developer, someone who would turn this place into apartments, and I imagined strangers living where my memories once lived, people walking through rooms that held pieces of my life without ever knowing it. I asked what would happen if I refused, and the way my younger son finally looked at me, sharp and impatient, told me everything I needed to know about how little my refusal would matter to them. He told me not to make it harder, and I realized then that they had already decided I would agree, that my role in all of this was simply to comply. I placed my cup of tea on the table, the sound small but final, and told them to leave the papers with me. My elder son resisted at first, saying they needed it done quickly, but I repeated myself, this time with a firmness that even surprised me, and something shifted in his expression. For the first time since they had arrived, he wasn't entirely in control of the moment, and that gave me a small sense of grounding in a situation that had otherwise left me unsteady. He eventually agreed, though not without making it clear they would return the next day, expecting an answer, expecting a signature, expecting compliance. As they stood to leave, I watched them carefully, noticing how neither of them looked back at the room, at the house, at me, in the way someone does when something still matters. At the door, my elder son told me to think about what was best, and I told him I would, knowing that what was best for me might not be what they had planned. When the gate closed behind them, the sound echoed through the house, settling into the silence they had left behind, and I stood there alone, surrounded by everything I had built, everything I had protected, everything I was now being asked to give up. For the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own home. But beneath that feeling, beneath the hurt and the disbelief, something else was beginning to form, something steady and unyielding. A quiet understanding that this was not the end of my story, no matter how easily they believed they had already written it for me. That night, I did not sleep. Not because I could not, but because something inside me refused to rest while my life stood on the edge of being taken from me. I sat in the same chair near the window where I had spent countless evenings waiting for my sons to return home when they were young, and the memory of those days pressed against me with a strange kind of clarity, as if my mind was trying to remind me of who I had been before this moment tried to redefine me. The house felt different now, not empty, not yet but uncertain, like it was listening, like it knew it was being discussed, measured, valued in ways that had nothing to do with the life it had held for so many years. I looked around slowly, taking in every detail, the old wooden cabinet, the faded rug, the clock that had ticked through decades of birthdays and quiet mornings, and I realized that everything I saw was being reduced to numbers in someone else's calculation. I picked up the papers they had left behind, my hand steady, even though my heart was not, and I began to read, not as a mother trusting her sons, but as a woman who needed to understand exactly what was being done in her name. The language was formal, distant, filled with words that created distance between emotion and action, ownership and transfer, consent and assumption, and as I read line after line, I began to see the shape of their plan more clearly than they had intended. They had already negotiated with the buyer, already agreed on terms, already positioned themselves as decision makers, and all that was missing was my signature, the final piece that would make everything legal, everything irreversible. I paused when I reached the section that mentioned my relocation. A small portion in the city, described in neat, efficient terms, as if comfort could be measured in square footage and convenience. There was no mention of what I would leave behind, no acknowledgement of what this house meant to me, no space in the document for memory or meaning, only structure, transfer, completion. I placed the papers back on the table and leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to think, to gather the parts of myself that still belonged to me before I made any decision that would take them away. I thought about the years I had spent building this life, the sacrifices that had never been written down, never documented, never formalized, yet somehow more real than anything printed on those pages. I remembered the nights I had gone to bed hungry so they could eat, the mornings I had woken before sunrise to make sure they never felt the weight of what we lacked, the quiet strength I had carried through every hardship without ever asking for recognition. And now, in this moment, all of that seemed invisible to them, irrelevant in the face of opportunity, convenience, progress. I stood up slowly and walked through the house, moving from room to room, touching things as I passed: the back of a chair, the edge of a table, the frame of a photograph, grounding myself in what was still real, what was still mine. In the bedroom, I opened the old trunk at the foot of my bed, the one I had not touched in years, and inside I found the documents I had kept carefully over time: property papers, old agreements, records that told a story very different from the one my sons were trying to write now. I sat on the edge of the bed and began to go through them one by one, my focus sharpening with each page, each detail, each piece of proof that reminded me I was not as powerless as they believed. The house was in my name, fully, completely, with no transfer, no shared ownership, no legal claim that could be made without my consent. And that realization settled into me with a quiet strength that began to replace the shock I had felt earlier. They had assumed I would not question, would not read, would not understand, and that assumption was their first mistake. I gathered the documents carefully and placed them beside the papers they had left, creating a contrast between what was real and what was being attempted, between truth and intention. As the night deepened, the silence around me grew heavier, but it no longer felt uncertain. It felt focused, like the stillness before something important begins. I returned to the living room and sat down again, this time not as someone waiting for something to happen, but as someone preparing for what would come next. I thought about calling someone, asking for advice, seeking support, but something inside me told me to wait, to think clearly before involving anyone else, to understand the full picture before taking the next step. My mind moved through possibilities, through outcomes, through consequences, not just for me but for them, because no matter what they had done, they were still my sons, and that truth complicated everything in ways that no document could capture. But another truth stood beside it now, equally strong, equally undeniable. I had the right to decide what happened to my home, to my life, to my future, and that right had not disappeared just because they had chosen to ignore it. As the first light of morning began to filter through the windows, I realized I had made a decision not about what I would sign, but about how I would respond, how I would carry myself in the face of what they had done. I would not shout, I would not beg, I would not break in front of them, because that would only confirm what they already believed, that I was weak, that I was incapable, that I could be managed. Instead, I would meet them with clarity, with calm, with the strength they had forgotten I possessed, and I would remind them, not with anger, but with certainty, that I was still the one who held the final say. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back on the table, exactly where they had left them, as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. Then I made myself a fresh cup of tea and sat down to wait for them to return, knowing that when they did, they would not find the same woman they had spoken to the day before. They would find someone who had spent the night remembering exactly who she was, and that would make all the difference. When my sons returned the next day, they came earlier than I expected, as if they were eager to finish what they had started, as if delay itself was something they could not afford. And I watched them from the window before opening the door, noticing the same expressions, the same certainty, the same quiet assumption that nothing had changed since yesterday. I opened the gate myself this time, not waiting for them to let themselves in, and as they stepped inside, I greeted them calmly, the same way I always had, because I wanted them to understand that my composure was not agreement, it was control. They sat in the living room again, the papers still lying exactly where they had left them, untouched on the surface, though everything about how I saw them had changed overnight. My elder son spoke first, asking if I had thought about it, his tone carrying a hint of impatience now, as if he expected the answer to be simple, immediate, final. I told him I had, and for a moment neither of them spoke, waiting for the word they believed would follow, the word that would allow them to move forward without resistance. Instead, I reached for the papers slowly, lifting them just enough to look at them again, before placing them back down. And then I looked directly at him and said that I had also read them carefully. That small shift in language caught his attention, and I saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross his face, brief but undeniable. He asked what I meant, and I told him I meant exactly what I said, that I had read every line, every clause, every detail, and that there were things in those papers that did not match the truth of my situation. The younger one shifted in his seat, his discomfort more visible now, and the room seemed to tighten around us as the conversation moved away from assumption and into reality. I told them that the house was in my name, fully and legally, and that no agreement could move forward without my consent, something they already knew but had hoped I would not assert. My elder son responded quickly, saying of course they knew that. That was why they needed my signature, trying to bring the conversation back to where he was comfortable, where he held the direction. But I did not let him guide it there again, because this was no longer his conversation to control. I asked him why the papers suggested arrangements that had already been finalized, why the language implied decisions that I had not been part of, and for a moment he did not have an answer ready. That moment was small, but it mattered, because it showed me that beneath his confidence there were gaps, assumptions, places where he had relied on my silence rather than my consent. He tried to explain that they had only made preliminary arrangements, that nothing was final until I agreed, but even as he spoke I could hear the shift in his tone, the careful adjustment as he realized the ground beneath him was not as steady as he thought. I listened without interrupting, letting him speak, letting him fill the silence with explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface but carried a different meaning underneath, one that was clearer to me now than it had been before. When he finished, I nodded slowly, not because I accepted what he said, but because I understood it, and then I told him that I would not sign. The words settled into the room with a weight that could not be ignored, and for a moment neither of them reacted, as if they needed time to process something they had not prepared for. Then the younger one spoke, his voice sharper now, asking what I meant, as if the words themselves required clarification, as if refusal was not something they had considered possible. I repeated myself, calmly, clearly, without hesitation. I would not sign those papers, not today, not tomorrow, not under the conditions they had presented. My elder son leaned back slightly, his expression tightening as he tried to regain control of the situation, and he began to speak about practicality again, about opportunity, about timing. But this time, his words did not carry the same weight because the foundation they stood on had already shifted. I let him finish before responding, telling him that practicality does not erase respect, that opportunity does not replace consent, and that timing does not justify decisions made without the person most affected by them. The younger one stood up, then pacing slightly, his frustration no longer hidden, and he said that I was being unreasonable, that I was making things harder than they needed to be, repeating the same words he had used the day before. But this time they sounded different, less certain, more reactive. I looked at him and told him that protecting my home was not unreasonable, that asking to be included in decisions about my own life was not difficult, and that what they were asking of me was not simple, no matter how they tried to frame it. The room felt heavier now, the air filled with everything that had been left unsaid for too long, and I could see that they were beginning to understand that this would not be resolved as easily as they had expected. My elder son tried a different approach, then his tone softening slightly, speaking about how they were only trying to help, how they were thinking about my future, how they wanted what was best for me. But I had heard those words before, and now I understood the space between what was said and what was meant. I told him that if they truly wanted what was best for me, they would have come to me first. They would have asked. They would have included me in the conversation before making decisions that affected my entire life. He did not respond immediately, and in that silence I felt something shift again, not just in him, but in the space between us, a recognition that things were no longer as simple as they had believed. The younger one stopped pacing and looked at me, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time since they had arrived the day before, and I wondered if he was beginning to see me not just as his mother, but as a person with her own will, her own rights, her own limits. I told them that I was not refusing to consider change, that I was not blind to the realities they were describing, but that change would happen on my terms, with my understanding, with my agreement, not as something imposed on me without my voice. My elder son exhaled slowly, the confidence he had carried into the room, now tempered by something more cautious, and he asked what I wanted, a question that should have been asked from the beginning but was only coming now. after resistance had made it necessary. I did not answer immediately because the question itself was not simple, and I wanted them to understand that my life could not be reduced to a quick decision, a convenient solution. Instead, I told them that if they wanted to discuss the future of the house, we would do it properly, with time, with clarity, with full transparency, and with respect for the fact that this was my home before it was anything else. They exchanged a look then, something unspoken passing between them, and I could see that they were recalculating, adjusting, trying to find a new way forward now that the path they had planned was no longer available. The younger one sat down again, quieter now, his earlier frustration giving way to something more uncertain, and the room, while still tense, felt different, less one-sided, more balanced. My elder son finally nodded, though not fully convinced, and said they would think about what I had said, that they would come back again after discussing it, and I agreed, because this was no longer about rushing to a conclusion. It was about making sure that whatever happened next would not erase me from my own story. When they stood to leave this time, their movements were slower, less certain, and as they reached the door, neither of them spoke immediately, as if the usual closing words did not fit the situation anymore. Finally, my elder son said they would be in touch, and I nodded, watching them step out into the courtyard, into the space that still belonged to me, even if they had already begun to see it differently. When the gate closed behind them again, the silence that followed felt different from the day before, not empty, not uncertain, but steady, grounded, as if something had been reclaimed, something small but important. I sat down in the living room once more, looking at the papers still lying on the table, and this time they did not feel like a threat, they felt like a reminder that I still had a voice, that I still had a choice, and that whatever came next would not happen without me being fully present in it. That evening, after my sons had left, I walked slowly through the rooms of the house, feeling the weight of every memory pressed into the walls, every mark in the wood that told a story of laughter, of arguments, of long nights spent worrying over bills, over their futures, over everything that had been expected of me as a mother. I paused in the kitchen, my hands brushing against the countertop I had scrubbed so many times, the surface now polished. Not for visitors, not for anyone else, but for myself. A small act of reclamation in a life that had been threatened with erasure. The smell of the bread I had baked that morning lingered faintly in the air, and I let it fill my lungs, letting the warmth of the memory settle into me, reminding me that I had built this life with my hands, with my care, and no paper, no argument, no hasty decision could take that away. I moved to the living room, the same room where they had sat, where words had been exchanged and authority challenged, and I sank into the armchair by the window, looking out at the garden I had tended for decades. Each rose, each marigold, each little sprout of something new carried a story, a victory, a small assertion of control in a life that had been threatened with being turned upside down overnight. I thought of the conversations that had already passed, the tension that had been released in some measure, the subtle acknowledgement that I was not merely a mother to be obeyed, but a woman whose rights and sense of self demanded respect even from those I had nurtured from birth. I allowed myself a slow breath, one that carried both relief and anticipation, knowing that the days ahead would be shaped not by fear, not by the momentum of assumptions, but by the deliberate and conscious choice to assert my voice, my authority, my presence in a house that was mine fully and completely. Later that night, I went to the small notebook where I had started recording the names, the dates, the deeds, the transactions that mattered, the documentation that might someday be necessary to protect what was mine. I wrote carefully, deliberately, with pen in hand, letting the ink flow as though it were capturing not just facts, but the essence of my resolve. Each line strengthened me, reminded me that I was no longer passive, that I would not be moved without understanding, without acknowledgement, without respect. I recorded everything I remembered from the day they first presented the documents, the words they used, the subtle manipulations, the phrases meant to pressure me into agreement. I wrote about their faces, their expressions, the slight hesitations that betrayed uncertainty even when confidence was projected. By the time I finished, the night was deep, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional rustle of a tree branch brushing the window, and I felt a sense of calm settle over me. Not a triumph yet, but a readiness for what was to come. I knew the next step would involve more than words, More than careful documentation, it would involve action, measured, deliberate, strategic, because this was not just about property, this was about dignity, about respect, about ensuring that no one could take what I had built or diminish what I had given. Sleep came slowly that night, each hour carrying dreams of decisions, of paths untaken, of the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that preparation, foresight, and clarity can turn fear into strength. The next morning I awoke early, before the sun had fully risen, and went out into the garden, my hands moving instinctively among the flowers, pulling weeds, planting seeds, arranging the soil just so. The rhythm of the earth beneath my fingers was grounding, a counterpoint to the chaos I had been confronted with the day before, and it reminded me that life continues, regardless of others' attempts to disrupt it. Breakfast was quiet, simple, yet deliberate. I set the table for one, though I knew my sons might arrive, though I knew that they might expect a confrontation, a reaction, a change in tone. I drank my tea slowly, savoring it, letting each sip remind me that control over my body, my space, my decisions was still mine, that I had the power to dictate my own life. By mid-morning, there was a knock at the door. Not forceful, not aggressive, but calculated, tentative. I opened it to see my younger son standing there, hesitation in his eyes, the familiar impatience tempered by uncertainty. He asked if he could speak to me, and I nodded, stepping aside to allow him into the living room. He did not sit immediately, standing instead as if unsure of where to place himself in the space he had assumed was already his domain. I gestured to the armchair opposite mine, and he sank into it, the weight of something unspoken settling between us. I asked him why he had come alone, and he admitted almost reluctantly that he wanted to discuss the situation before involving his brother, that he hoped to understand my perspective, perhaps even to reconcile some sense of order with the chaos he had helped create. I listened, not interrupting, letting his words fill the space, noting the subtle changes in his tone, the flicker of doubt, the careful choice of words, the way he sought approval while knowing he had none. I spoke carefully, deliberately, explaining the difference between wanting to help and imposing one's will, between convenience and respect, between assumption and consent. I reminded him that the house, the land, the decisions that affected my life were mine to make, and that any consideration for them had to begin with my understanding, my agreement, not as an afterthought. He nodded slowly, beginning to grasp the distinction, though uncertainty lingered like a shadow, and for a moment I saw in his eyes a reflection of the lessons he had only begun to learn. I told him that I appreciated his initiative, that I valued thoughtfulness, that I respected intention, but that intention without respect is hollow, and that decisions made in haste and certainty, in disregard of the one most affected, were nothing more than theft of both property and dignity. The room grew quieter then, the tension shifting subtly as he absorbed my words, as he realized that this conversation was different, that I was different, that the dynamic had shifted in ways he could not easily undo. He asked what steps I would take next, and I told him that I would review everything, consult my lawyer, ensure that all documentation was correct, and only then consider how to move forward, emphasizing that forward would be defined by me, not by him, not by anyone else. He left that day with no promises made, no agreement reached, only the understanding that I would not be moved without consideration, without respect, without full knowledge of the facts and the implications of every decision. That night I wrote again in my notebook, detailing every moment of the visit, every word spoken, every nuance of body language, every shift in tone, capturing a record that was as much a testament to my resolve as it was a tool for the future. Over the next few days I began consulting with my lawyer, reviewing all legal documents, deeds, powers of attorney, and financial statements, verifying that everything was in order, and discovering minor discrepancies that, if left unchecked, could have allowed my sons to advance their plans without my knowledge. Each discovery strengthened my resolve, confirmed the necessity of careful planning, and reminded me that I had survived far more difficult challenges in life, far more complex manipulations, far more subtle attempts to diminish me. With a clear understanding of the legal framework, I planned my next move strategically, aware that patience, observation, and calculated action would be more powerful than anger, confrontation, or impulsive retaliation. I documented every communication, every phone call, every potential leverage point, creating a roadmap that allowed me to anticipate responses, to guide outcomes, and to ensure that my voice would be heard, respected, and ultimately decisive. In the evenings, I returned to the garden, to the kitchen, to the quiet spaces where memory and control intertwined, grounding myself in the tangible reality of my home, my space, my life, preparing mentally, emotionally, and strategically for the inevitable confrontation that would follow. The peace I cultivated in these hours was deliberate, a necessary armor against the stress of what lay ahead, and as I moved through my home, touching familiar surfaces, rearranging small things for my satisfaction rather than theirs, I felt a quiet satisfaction in asserting my ownership of the present moment, even as I prepared to reclaim what had been threatened. The morning of the confrontation arrived with a quiet that felt almost conspiratorial, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see how the long-simmering tension between mother and sons would finally unfold. I prepared meticulously, my notebook open beside me, my lawyer on standby, and every legal document reviewed and double-checked. My breakfast was simple, but deliberate: tea poured in a cup I liked, a slice of bread toasted to perfection. Every detail mattered, because this day was not just about property, it was about dignity, respect, and the quiet assertion of authority that had been ignored for far too long. By mid-morning, the first of my sons arrived. He was careful, measured, attempting a tone of casual concern that belied the tension in his eyes. I invited him to sit, gesturing to the chair opposite mine, and he hesitated for a moment before lowering himself into it. I looked directly at him, letting the weight of my presence fill the room, letting him feel the gravity of the choices he had made. I reminded him calmly but with unmistakable firmness that the house, the land, and all associated decisions belonged to me, that my consent was required for any transaction or change, and that any attempt to bypass that consent was not only disrespectful but legally questionable. His face tightened, a flicker of guilt or fear passing through his expression, and I knew I had his attention. I laid out the documents I had prepared, highlighting the discrepancies I had discovered, the powers of attorney that had been misrepresented, and the accounts that had been manipulated. Each point was deliberate, precise, and backed by legal authority. I spoke slowly, ensuring he understood the full scope of the situation, the mistakes he had made, and the potential consequences if these actions were not rectified. I could see the shift in his demeanor, the tension coiling in his shoulders, the uncertainty in his eyes as he realized that I was not the passive, pliable figure he had assumed. We moved through the discussion methodically, each point punctuated by evidence, by the calm insistence of someone who knows their rights and will not be swayed by manipulation or intimidation. I did not raise my voice, I did not plead, I did not threaten. Instead, I relied on the strength of preparation, the clarity of facts, and the undeniable reality that the house, the land, and the decision-making authority were mine, and would remain so unless I chose otherwise. He attempted to interject, to appeal to shared history, to invoke memories of care and sacrifice, but I listened patiently, letting his words wash over me, acknowledging them without allowing them to derail the focus of the meeting. After hours of discussion, the initial confrontation ended with no immediate resolution, but with a clear understanding on both sides. The status quo would not hold, the old assumptions would not govern the future, and the actions taken without my consent would be corrected. My son left that day visibly unsettled, walking through the door with a mixture of guilt, frustration, and cautious respect. I remained behind, reviewing my notes, reinforcing my plans, and preparing for the next stage. Over the following days, I engaged my lawyer in a detailed strategy, ensuring that every legal avenue was explored and that the process would be efficient, deliberate, and enforceable. We filed motions to correct the documents that had been signed under misrepresentation, verified the ownership of accounts, and ensured that all filings would hold up under scrutiny. Each action was taken with careful consideration, with the patience of someone who understands that haste is often the enemy of justice. During this time, I also took care of my personal space, reinforcing boundaries, reclaiming control over the home that had been threatened. I rearranged the furniture not for them, but for me, moved personal items back into spaces where they belonged, and created an environment that reflected my authority, my taste, and my intention to live fully and deliberately. The act of organizing, of shaping my environment, provided both solace and a visual affirmation of the power I retained in my own life. One evening, as I sat on the porch drinking tea, I reflected on the broader implications of the confrontation. This was more than a property dispute. It was a test of the relationships, of respect, of the recognition that elders deserve consideration, that sacrifice is not a blank check for exploitation, and that dignity cannot be taken without consent. I realized that by asserting myself, I was not only protecting my assets, but also modeling for future generations, including grandchildren, the importance of standing firm, of valuing oneself, and of recognizing the moral and legal weight of every action. The second son arrived later that week, and the process repeated with similar precision. I allowed him to speak, acknowledging his perspective, but maintaining control over the discussion, insisting on respect for both my autonomy and my legal rights. The conversation was tense, filled with the echoes of past arguments and the unspoken weight of betrayal. But it was conducted under the rules I set, in the language of evidence, fairness, and principle. He too left with a clearer understanding. My voice, my decision, my control could not be ignored or overridden. With both sons temporarily at bay, I turned my attention to the home itself, ensuring that the property was in order, that every account, every document, every piece of legal paperwork was organized, accessible, and ready for enforcement if necessary. I found a sense of empowerment in these tasks, a quiet joy in the precision and care with which I could now manage every aspect of my life without interference or threat. I knew that this groundwork would serve not only to protect my property, but also to reinforce my sense of agency, my autonomy, and my dignity. I also began preparing emotionally for the next stage. The legal battles were one aspect, but the interpersonal reconciliation, or lack thereof, was another. I anticipated resistance, denial, and perhaps anger from my sons, and I braced myself to respond not with retribution, but with controlled, principled action. Every decision I made was calculated to assert my authority, reclaim my space, and protect my legacy without succumbing to impulsive emotion. This strategy, while painstaking, ensured that I remained in control, that my peace remained intact, and that every move was deliberate rather than reactive. In the quiet hours of the night, I reflected on my life, the sacrifices I had made, and the resilience I had cultivated. I realized that this struggle was not merely about land or money. It was about recognition, about respect, about the principle that one's life and property are not to be commandeered under the guise of familial authority. I felt a renewed sense of purpose, an unwavering commitment to uphold my rights, and a deep understanding that true empowerment comes from preparation, knowledge, and the courage to act when necessary. Days turned into weeks as the legal process moved forward. Each filing, each communication, each verification strengthened my position. I felt a quiet satisfaction in the meticulous work, in the careful documentation, and in the knowledge that every step I took was both fair and unassailable. I also began to notice subtle changes in the community. Neighbors who had previously looked on passively now offering quiet words of encouragement or expressions of understanding. The respect that had been eroded through haste and assumption was slowly being restored, a testament to the power of deliberate action and the inevitability of justice when pursued with care and precision. One afternoon, I received confirmation that the motions had been accepted, that the documents previously signed without my consent were invalidated, and that my ownership and control were legally reinforced. The relief was tangible but not overwhelming. This was not the end, only a crucial milestone in the reclamation of my authority and dignity. I prepared a plan for communication with my sons, ensuring that any interaction would be guided by principle, respect, and clarity, avoiding the pitfalls of emotional manipulation or impulsive confrontation. As I reviewed the documents one final time, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. The house, the land, and every asset was secured under my control. The legal avenues were clear, enforceable, and protected by the careful preparation I had undertaken. More importantly, my sense of agency, my dignity, and my autonomy had been restored. The silence that followed was not passive. It was a deliberate assertion of peace and control, a signal that while the battle had been challenging, the outcome had been determined by intellect, strategy, and unwavering self-respect. Evenings were spent in reflection, journaling, and tending to the garden that had always been my sanctuary. Each flower planted, each weed removed, each small task completed was a reaffirmation of life, of growth, and of the right to live fully on my terms. I allowed myself moments of quiet joy, appreciating the subtle victories, the clarity of purpose, and the enduring strength that had carried me through every challenge. These moments were not fleeting. They were deliberate, conscious choices to inhabit my life fully and without compromise. The culmination of these weeks was not dramatic confrontation, but a steady assertion of rights, a reinforcement of boundaries, and a deliberate cultivation of personal sovereignty. The sons, aware now of the strength, preparation, and clarity I possessed, approached cautiously, with respect tempered by the memory of their earlier misjudgments. Every interaction was guided by principle, by law, and by a recognition that I would not be coerced, manipulated, or overridden. In this way, the narrative shifted. No longer was it a story of potential loss and fear, but of deliberate reclamation, strategic empowerment, and measured triumph. The following weeks unfolded with a new rhythm, one that I had carefully cultivated through strategy, patience, and persistence. Each morning began with the same deliberate routine: a strong cup of tea, a glance over the garden, and a review of the day's plans. The roses I had planted along the fence bloomed brighter than ever, a silent message that resilience can flourish even in the harshest seasons. Every corner of the house, every piece of furniture, every small object carried the weight of history, memory, and deliberate reclamation. I walked through each room not as someone who had lost, but as a woman who had weathered storms, fought for her dignity, and emerged with authority firmly in her hands. Tyler remained my steadfast companion during this time. His presence was not just comforting, it was a testament to the continuity of family when guided by principle and care. We worked together in the garden, planted vegetables, and nurtured flowers, creating spaces that symbolized growth, patience, and the deliberate crafting of life. His questions about the family's history reminded me of lessons passed down, stories that had been neglected, and values I wanted to instill in a new generation. Each interaction with him reaffirmed my understanding that legacy is not measured in property alone, but in the knowledge, character, and love that one imparts. My sons, though still nearby, maintained a cautious distance. The one who had instigated the legal battle occasionally appeared at the edge of the driveway, trying to seem casual, yet the tension in his posture betrayed the recognition that the dynamic had shifted irreversibly. He had underestimated me once, and the consequences had been unavoidable. I did not need to confront him. Silence and consistent principle spoke louder than words. Every measured glance he cast, every careful approach, was a reminder that authority is reinforced not only through action, but through the quiet consistency of one's presence and boundaries. The legal victories had provided protection, but I knew the true security lay in maintaining awareness and vigilance. I updated my estate plans, ensuring Tyler's future would be secure and that the rest of my assets could support initiatives for other elders in crisis. By establishing a trust fund and contributing to local senior programs, I transformed my personal experience into a source of empowerment for others. The house and property were more than material possessions. They were instruments of influence, platforms to demonstrate that standing firm can create both justice and positive impact. During these weeks, I returned to painting and personal creativity, reclaiming passions that had been sidelined for years. Each brushstroke was an act of liberation, a reclamation of time, energy, and emotional space. I painted landscapes of the old house, gardens in full bloom, and portraits inspired by memories. These works became daily affirmations of control, beauty, and autonomy. Even as Tyler assisted in simple chores or observed quietly from a distance, I understood that art, like life, is strengthened when it is deliberate, intentional, and guided by the hand of one who refuses to yield to adversity. Interactions with the community shifted as well. Neighbors who had observed the disputes from afar now approached with respect and empathy. Some shared their own stories of family conflicts, elder neglect, or struggles with property and inheritance. By listening and offering guidance, I became a quiet mentor, someone whose experience validated the trials of others. This connection reinforced the understanding that standing up for oneself is not just a personal journey. It has ripples, inspiring change, awareness, and empowerment in those who witness it. Tyler and I continue to grow closer, establishing routines that combined education, work, and leisure. We bathed together, cooked family recipes, and spent evenings in conversation about life, history, and responsibility. These moments were not only nurturing but instructional, shaping a young man's understanding of ethical behavior, respect, and accountability. He learned that true legacy is not about punishment or revenge alone. It is about integrity, resilience, and using one's experiences to guide and uplift others. Watching him absorb these lessons reminded me of the broader purpose of the reclamation, securing a foundation of dignity, responsibility, and care for future generations. Occasionally, my sons attempted minor approaches to reconnect, often in indirect ways, passing by the driveway, sending casual messages, or asking questions through mutual contacts. Each time I responded with measured neutrality, acknowledging basic civility while maintaining the boundaries that had taken so much effort to establish. These interactions underscored a principle I had learned repeatedly: authority and respect cannot be demanded. They must be recognized and earned through consistent actions and ethical conduct. By enforcing this principle calmly and firmly, I preserved not only my property and autonomy, but also the psychological balance that had been so long disrupted. The quiet of my reclaimed life allowed for reflection, gratitude, and planning. I revisited financial documents, estate plans, and community initiatives, ensuring that every step aligned with my long-term objectives. The trust I established for Tyler, combined with contributions to local programs for seniors, reflected a philosophy that power, when wielded responsibly, is amplified by purpose and moral clarity. This careful planning transformed the legal and personal victories into something lasting and meaningful, extending beyond mere property to lessons of resilience, justice, and integrity. Evenings became times of reflection and storytelling. Tyler and I would sit on the porch, watching the sunset, discussing memories, lessons, and the family's history. These conversations reinforced the understanding that healing and legacy are processes, not single events. The values I had fought to protect, autonomy, respect, and dignity, were now tangible in the way Tyler approached life. The garden thrived, and the neighborhood acknowledged the integrity of my actions. Peace, I realized, is not passive. It is actively created, maintained, and nurtured, often through deliberate choices that prioritize principle over emotion or convenience. The impact of the property dispute extended beyond my immediate family. Other elders, particularly women, began reaching out to me for guidance, sharing fears of losing control, property, or dignity. By responding, offering advice, and creating pathways for empowerment, I became a source of practical and emotional support. It was not about fame or recognition. It was about ensuring that the injustices I had endured would not remain isolated stories. Each interaction reminded me that personal struggle, when managed wisely, can transform into community empowerment and enduring influence. Through this period, my son's behavior shifted subtly but meaningfully. Their attempts to control, manipulate, or challenge were met with calm assertion and unwavering principle. They learned, through observation and experience, that influence cannot be forced, entitlement cannot replace accountability, and disrespect carries consequences. Their transformation was not immediate nor complete, but the lessons had been imparted quietly, consistently, and effectively, reinforcing the broader message that dignity and authority are maintained, not by anger or confrontation alone, but through patience, strategy, and integrity. I also devoted more time to personal well-being, understanding that autonomy is inseparable from health, strength, and clarity of mind. Regular walks, proper nutrition, and mindful reflection became daily rituals, reinforcing the connection between physical capability and the ability to act decisively. Painting, gardening, and mentoring Tyler served as both emotional and physical exercises, cultivating focus, patience, and resilience. The integration of these practices affirmed that personal empowerment is holistic, encompassing mind, body, spirit, and environment. As the weeks turned into months, the neighborhood itself adjusted to the new reality. My sons remained physically present but socially distant, aware of the boundaries that had been established and the consequences of prior actions. The quietude of my life became a symbol of controlled authority, a presence that commanded respect without overt confrontation. Tyler flourished under these conditions, thriving in a home defined by principle, support, and empowerment rather than conflict or chaos. The culmination of this period of reclamation was both subtle and profound. I had restored my property, secured Tyler's future, and created a framework for ongoing influence within the community. Legal victories, while critical, were only part of the achievement. True success lay in the careful assertion of autonomy, the reinforcement of ethical principles, and the cultivation of a life defined by dignity, respect, and purpose. Each decision, interaction, and ritual was a deliberate act of empowerment, ensuring that the lessons learned through hardship would extend beyond the immediate conflict to benefit future generations. Ultimately, I understood that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of principle, control, and clarity. By asserting my rights, maintaining boundaries, and nurturing the next generation, I transformed what could have been a story of loss and betrayal into one of resilience, influence, and lasting legacy. Tyler, my companion and student, embodied the continuation of these principles, carrying forward the lessons of respect, accountability, and empowerment. My sons, once dismissive and entitled, now understood, through observation and consequence, the weight of their actions. Looking back, the day my sons threw me out over a piece of land was a turning point, not just in terms of property, but in the reclamation of identity, autonomy, and legacy. Every decision, every action, every moment of patience had contributed to a life now defined by empowerment rather than victimhood. The house, the garden, the trust, and the community engagement were tangible reminders of what can be achieved when resilience, principle, and strategy intersect. What had begun as a painful, isolating experience evolved into a narrative of triumph, dignity, and enduring influence. As the sun set over the garden one evening, Tyler and I sat on the porch with a quiet sense of completion. The roses glowed in the fading light, the vegetables thrived, and the air carried the subtle hum of peace restored. The house that had once been a source of conflict now radiated life, learning, and dignity. I understood, finally, that the measure of a home is not in its walls or its land, but in the principles, love, and respect that inhabit it. And in that quiet realization, I felt something profound, a victory not measured by confrontation or revenge, but by the enduring reclamation of life, voice, and legacy.